Yeah, so welcome back, everyone. I'm joined today by Chris Langan. I think for most of you, he's probably a man that needs no introduction. But, one thing I found interesting, Chris, was, obviously, we're going to talk about the CTMU, but you're very well known for your high IQ. But what I found interesting was, in a way, it's kind of extraordinary how ordinary a life you've had, and that it seems like IQ is a benefit up to a certain point. But there seems to be a lot of evidence to suggest that past a certain point, it can become kind of an impediment for people. Like it correlates with a lot of, anxiety disorders, ADHD, these types of
Things like
things past a
autism and
certain point.
Asperger's, things like that, yeah, and
Yeah, so
also
I
social
was
ineptitude
wondering.
as well.
Yeah, so I was wondering. Do you have a theory as to why you seem to be quite a well balanced person, kind of in spite of that? It always seems like extraordinary in itself.
Well, yes, I do have a theory of intelligence, if that's what you're talking about. The CTMU is, in fact, a theory of intelligence. Was a author, well-known author. You've probably heard of him. His name was Malcolm Gladwell. It put me in a book of his, and actually, he had a theory about me, and that is that the reason that Chris Langan, despite his intelligence, has never really managed to get anywhere is that he is totally socially inept, and he's got no grasp of certain realities that you have to cope with if you want to actually get anywhere in the world. And I found that I always found that a little bit. I mean, I like Malcolm, and I think he wrote a fine book, but I disagree with his theory about what makes me tick and why I didn't get anywhere. The fact of the matter is that we live in a world that, in a lot of ways, is unacceptable. Okay, and I'm the kind of person who, if I decide that something is unacceptable, I'm not going to go along with certain aspects of it. I'm not going to sell my soul to a corporation that I believe is doing bad things, things that are bad for the world, and so forth. And that comes down to something that you might call moral intelligence. And in other words, morality actually takes intelligence to be correctly applied in the world. And if you have too much of that, then you're going to end up with all kinds of problems in terms of getting along with other people and going along with the status quo and playing along with the power structure. So this was one of the problems that I had. Now, as for other people, IQ is really, it's measuring a very narrow set of abilities or capacities that you have. Intelligence is something that you can actually apply over a very wide area. It can be over a very long period of time, and it can be all over the place in terms of the factors and ingredients into which it taps. Okay, and IQ is a very narrow, restricted sense of those things where you got to focus everything in an hour or so, the period in which you take the test. And this is not really how intelligence works. That's an artificially narrow view of what intelligence is. A lot of the world's greatest geniuses who've come up with a lot of our best ideas have, they've been all over the place, and their insights have been protracted and stretched out over a longer period of time. So the focus isn't as tight, but the angle is wider. In other words, there's more breadth to the way they're working, and less of the narrowness and penetration that you get that shows up as a high score on an IQ test. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear that Malcolm Gladwell wrote that, because actually watching your interviews, I got the opposite vibe. It seems like you have a lot of emotional intelligence. It seems like you're quite personable. But like you said, that's another thing about IQ maybe that people don't factor in is past a certain point, a lot of the incentives that our society runs on, they stop appealing to people past certain IQ, whether that's monetary or
Well,
um,
that's exactly right. That's probably one of the reasons that IQ doesn't correlate with success above a certain level. Up to a certain level, you get up into the danger zone, 150 or so. Up to that level, intelligence can be a great advantage in getting ahead in the world. But if you're smarter than that, then you start to see flaws and inconsistencies in the way things work. And then if you have any character at all, you're not going to be willing to go along with them to quite the extent that would conduce to your personal success. So that's what happens to people.
yeah. So as far as formulating the CTMU, you didn't have an academic background. So did you come at that through just your own learning of philosophy, or was it science that got you interested in that? What was your first kind of big intellectual interest?
Well, it was just a gradual thing that started when I was young. I started asking questions and seeing contradictions in the way that adults answered those questions for me. So I started thinking there's got to be a better way. So I started doing reading and realized that there are a lot of bright people out there, and some of them have come up with partial solutions, but there's no grand solution. There's nothing tying all of these little insights together. Even though a lot of people that come up with these brilliant insights end up thinking that they're the end all be all and actually a theory of everything. That's not what they really are. That's a kind of an intellectual narcissism thing that creeps into the process. So I saw that there was no actual overall coherent system out there, and realized the need for one. What ties everything together? And then I realized that people have made insights along those lines too. And so I started at it from first principles. I just went along, okay, what do we know? How can we come by logically and verifiably come by a true picture of the universe, what its structure is, how causation works, why things happen? What does it actually take to do that? And that's what led me to the CTMU.
So, just for a basic intro for the audience, I mean, what does the CTMU tell us about the nature of reality?
Well, it tells us really a whole huge amount. It's a cosmology, right? It outlines the universe as well. There's several ways to describe it. Okay, you can describe it as a comprehensive metaphysical description of the structure and dynamics of reality, or as I put it, the triadic identity of reality, in which cognitive theory equals model equals universe. There's the way theories are usually structured. They're structured as formal systems, and they're kept apart. They're set apart from their universes of discourse, right? Which in this case would be reality. If you want a theory of reality, then reality is your universe of discourse. What the CTMU does is it combines cognitive theory and model and universe in one entity, in one quantum, right? That's right in the name. I mean, if you look at the name, it's cognitive theoretic model of the universe. It's right there in the name, what the CTMU does. There's another way to describe it as well. You could describe it as a logico-geometric system that reflects the self-containment or closure, the ontic algebraic closure of reality, right? Which is just a mathematical way of saying self-containment. And in that sense, it ends up looking like a kind of stratified metaphysical operator algebra. Okay? You could also describe it as, well, the way I do in my papers, I describe it as a kind of ultimate language called the metaformal system. That combines formal systems with their universes of discourse, as I said before, and couples ontology and epistemology, right? And it couples ontology and epistemology. Those are usually thought of as being separate philosophical disciplines, but I couple them for the simple reason that an attribution of existence requires knowledge of the argument of that attribution. If you're going to have a function that attributes existence to something, then you have to know what you're attributing it to. So obviously there is no such thing as a separation of ontology and epistemology. So the language that comes out of this ultimate language, the metaformal system, it can be characterized as a language that talks to itself, about itself, for its own purposes, which are logical and experiential self-identification. Okay? So you've got this closed language, this high-level ultimate kind of language. Then you can think of it as a metaphysical extension of physics. You know what physics is, right? It's an empirical science that studies the physical world, which is the world of perceptions and observations. It's a metaphysical extension of physics, which has a certain kind of self-duality that's called conspansive self-duality, which means that it expands inwardly instead of exploding outwardly. People know that the universe is expanding, right? You look outward and you see it expanding. That's not actually what's happening. It is happening, but it's only happening in coupling with a kind of an implosion that is dual to the explosion. You see what I mean? That's conspansion. So you've got this self-dual thing going on. You could also say that it's an ultimate reality self-simulation. All right, everybody knows what a simulation is. That's like in the movie The Matrix or other movies like Tron or there are a number of them these days. But it's about a self-simulation of ultimate reality within a metaverse. And now everybody knows about that phrase because Zuck used it to rebrand Facebook. But in reality, that's my term and my concept. And what it amounts to is an existential potential for any possible universe. I was the first person to describe the structure of that. And then I guess, finally, you could actually portray it as a meta-religious framework for the logical reconciliation of various faiths. And it does this by coupling faith and knowledge, just the same way we coupled ontology and epistemology, right? And it uses a special kind of metaphysical logic to do this. So finally, you could call it an extension of logic itself. So the CTMU is all of those things.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear your analogy between language. I often hear you describe the CTMU that reality is language-like, because it kind of reminds me of the pre-Socratics and Greek philosophy, and the word they use, logos. Reality
right.
is
Parmenides and Plato's theory of forms, and logos, right, which is the word. That's what logos is basically referring to. And so yes, a language is the ultimate generalization of the metaphysical language that we're talking about. This metaformal system is the ultimate generalization of those concepts that were known to the ancient Greeks, right? In many ways, the entire history of philosophy comes together in this system. It's the ultimate. There's something called the system building approach in philosophy, which I suppose the most recent and most famous exponent of that might be Hegel. But the idea is to build a grand system that describes everything, where everything fits, right? That's what the CTMU actually is. It wasn't, Hegel didn't have the machinery to make the theoretical or logical machinery to make that work. The CTMU does. So basically, it's a grand system of everything, is what it comes to.
And as far as it ties into the Western tradition, I mean, is there a philosopher that you would see as kind of having come closest to the CTMU? As you say, it does remind me a little bit of Hegel and maybe like Alfred North Whitehead in the 20th century,
right?
like
Process philosophy. And before him, Bergson, who was another process philosopher guy. Yes, there are literally. I mean, if I had to tip my hat to every philosopher who came by insight that is relevant to the CTMU, I would have to mention a very large percentage of them, right? As far as the ones who really came close, who the hell should I mention here? I should probably mention, of course, we've already mentioned Plato, Plato with his theory of forms and his allegory of the cave, and Aristotle, who was actually a pupil of Plato, who first distinguished physics from metaphysics and made a number of inroads, including the nature of logic and the empirical sciences. And then moving on to the medieval, or to the actually the kind of post-Christian area, that you've got Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, and then I guess the one that I would, then a couple of people deserve mention. One of them is, of course, Descartes, who came up with his idea of mind-body dualism, and a mechanistic, that was the first and most successful mechanistic approach to physical reality, with his coordinate systems and his analytic geometry. Everybody knows that, but of course, Cartesian dualism also presents a lot of problems because it artificially separates mind from body and kind of like pretends that there's really no way to connect them, even though they're obviously connected. But after Descartes, I'd have to say that the most important person to mention would be Leibniz. Leibniz had something called the monadology, right? The Leibniz monadology, which basically says that reality consists of monads or coherent quanta that are a little bit similar to Descartes. Descartes had these mechanistic corpuscles, right, which he considered reality to be composed. But they were basically, Leibniz's monadology consists of monads, which are also simple entities of which everything is composed, but they're explicitly metaphysical in essence. He describes them as soul-like. Right? Which means that they can actually describe these human beings, which are examples of what I call in the CTMU secondary tellers. We're all secondary tellers, right? And from this monadology, he believed that eternal universal truths, are accessible to reason using two main principles, which were the principle of contradiction You know what that was? That was a proposition that has to be either true or false. A proposition must be either true or false, can't be both or neither. And the principle of sufficient reason, which is that nothing happens without a reason. Right? There's going to be a sufficient reason for everything to happen. And the CTMU makes full use of both of those principles. However, in reality, it takes considerably more logic than those two principles to build a theory of reality. Right?
Yeah, when you
So,
mention,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say when you mentioned Leibniz, obviously with an extension to the principle of sufficient reason was Leibniz's conclusion that this universe exists because God created it because it's the best of all possible worlds. I'm curious, in the CTMU, there's all this talk from modern physicists about multiverse and why this universe and not others, and some have proposed a fine-tuning argument on that basis. I'm curious, in the CTMU, what would your answer be to why this universe and not the other infinite possibilities? Is this the best possible world that God shows, or is there an element of kind of freedom in it on God's part, or?
It's the best because it provides the potential for the best possible outcome. However, it's up to us whether or not that outcome is going to be realized. So the universe is perfect. It's been perfectly structured for that purpose, okay? But we're constantly lousing it up. As a matter of fact, life itself kind of louses it up in many ways, right? I mean, there's a lot of cruelty in the world of biological evolution, for example, that appears to be pointless and appears to make this something other than the best of all possible worlds. But if you take everything into account, from the beginning of reality to the very end of reality, from the alpha to the omega, and the entirety of reality, the entire universe, and you then evaluate that statement over everything, this is the best of all possible worlds. That's the way it was structured. And as a matter of fact, it was structured so that within this universe, it is necessary to come to that conclusion. So Leibniz was 100% right about that. It's just that there is a lot that goes into, we need to cooperate with that. We're evolving to the point at which we can make this the best of all possible worlds for ourselves and for the other species that live in it. But we haven't reached that stage yet. Okay? God allowed for us to evolve to that stage and gave us all the incentives, both positive and negative, to evolve there. And that's what we've been doing. And now, of course, they're trying to stop that evolution dead by, with this nonsense that they're pulling now. But we won't go into that. Or maybe we will. It's up to you.
I have a feeling we'll get into that a little bit later, but yeah, I just want to cover more of the basics of CTMU. So evolution is purposive in this system. So I guess the question is, what is life evolving towards? Like what is the end purpose of conscious beings?
It's basically the self-identification of reality, experientially and logically. Reality is seeking to know itself. This is a correlate of the fact that ontology and epistemology are coupled. The reason for being is self-knowledge of the universe, or the primary monad, as Leibniz would have put it, which is God. Okay? Leibniz believed in God. And of course, he had a stratospheric level of intelligence, as did Newton, as did Descartes, as did a lot of the other people that were considered great philosophers in that day. They all believed in God. And there's a very good reason for that, because without God, you can't build an overall theory of reality. It's the first requirement. You need something from which all of the coherence of reality derives. All right? And it turns out that there's only one way to describe that. And that way turns out to also double as a description of God. All right. Now we can argue, quibble about the properties of God. Well, what is a divine property? What is God really? But this is the way it turns out. There are all kinds of people today who are trying to tell you that, philosophers of this magnitude were totally idiotic, right? And the universe is all mechanistic, according to, as depicted in the mechanistic semi-model of Descartes. But that has never been the case. Okay? Well, people are being deluded about that now. So we've got to get back to this generic description of God that is necessary to our understanding of reality.
And how would you evaluate the kind of traditional arguments for God, like the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the ontological argument? Because obviously these really went out of fashion with Kant, didn't they? He kind of deconstructed that these were all a version of the ontological argument, and that this made existence predicate. This kind of argument was really influential, and it seems like sort of theistic apologetics has kind of fallen by the wayside since Kant, although it seems to be having something of a resurgence. I read a book called Universes by a philosopher called John Leslie recently that really argued powerfully for modern fine-tuning argument, just based off what we know about modern physics, things like the cosmological constant. So I'm curious how you'd evaluate them, and if there's one of those that you think is especially powerful.
They all have their proper context. The most powerful and general argument is usually called is something that is usually called the ontological argument, right? Which was basically put forth by Anselm and has been repeated in numerous forms by other philosophers. But within the framework of that ontological argument, which is, by the way, the CTMU, all of the conventional arguments for God, the cosmological, teleological argument, all of them can be interpreted. Okay, but you need this overall logical framework, this metalogical framework, in which to interpret them. Okay, these guys were all, great philosophers that bless their hearts, were working without a grand overall philosophical framework, and they were trying their best, but a lot of their efforts came to naught for that reason. We can do better.
Another thing I find interesting is, as you describe it, some of the language, it sounds very much like, in a way, you're getting back to a traditionalist conception of the world. Like the Hindus have this idea of, the veil of Maya, that reality is something like a simulation, I guess, if they were to use more modern terminology. And Indra's net kind of signifies this kind of holographic nature of reality, that you have the drops of water on a web and each of them reflects all the others, that reality is kind of holographic.
Holography, yes, right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And even the process that, the ultimate purpose basically is that it's divine play, and it's this absolute consciousness, Brahman, kind of coming to know itself through finite existence. So, it's kind of extraordinary that in a way you're kind of revivifying like a traditionalist cosmology.
Precisely. I mean, you've got Brahman, at the top, which is kind of like the one, okay, the absolute, and then you've got out of that you've got an emanation where it comes down to the next level, which kind of plays the role of cognitive syntax or a formal realm, and then that filters down into the world, right? And it's that basic. You can take that basic theological construct, which is how the Vedic philosophers regarded it. You can take that and actually map that directly into the CTMU. You can do the same thing with Neoplatonism, which is in some ways similar to Vedism, in that you've got the one, and then you've got down below that you've got nous, which is cosmic mind, and then that filters down into the world. Okay, and all of this can be likened to a self-simulation of reality. It's kind of like Plato's cave allegory on steroids, right? That's a simulation too. People see illusory shadows on the wall that are cast, by objects moving in front of a fire behind them on the cave wall, right? And so that's basically what it all comes down to. Once again, the CTMU puts this all together, just defining everything properly and fitting everything together in such a way that it works, which is what the rest of these philosophers saw. They each saw part of the picture, but none of them saw the whole picture.
So would this lead to something of a kind of perennialist interpretation of religion, where
exactly
they're all
right? Yes.
Yeah. So they're all reaching at this ultimate truth, but of course they have their own confines of language and tradition, and maybe they don't have some of the advanced science we have to explain this in more mechanical terms. But
exactly.
that presumably gives you a kind of way to evaluate religion. I mean, would you say that there's kind of a hierarchy of religion, or would you say that it's all it's all grasping at the same ultimate reality?
Well, there's a hierarchy of religion in terms that some religions are truer than others. In some, the universal truths of reality are better expressed than others. So, yes, there's that kind of hierarchy. But what is required, once again, is this meta religious framework. This metaformal system is a framework in which all of these religions, these faiths, can be interpreted logically. Okay, and then once you get them in there, then you understand how they really relate to each other. And once you understand how they relate to each other, then you can start working on removing the conflicts between them. There's a lot of misunderstanding there. If one guy is a Muslim, another guy is a Christian, and another is a Hindu, they're going to come to loggerheads over certain concepts and what they mean, right? The CTMU shows what they mean. And this is a very important thing. That's why the CTMU is a meta religion in a sense, because it works with the ultimate model of reality that was used by Vedic philosophers and by Neoplatonists and others that have tried to put together a grand synthesis, unsuccessfully in most cases. That's what the CTMU is, and it's the first system that actually brings that to bear. It has to be this kind of ultimate language that I spoke of. It has to be the metaformal system. So that's the way it works.
Right, because again, as the kind of traditionalist writers would say, is that there is a personal and an impersonal aspect to God, and so in a sense, you have your more religions that are more focused on the personal nature of God and focused on that kind of divine relationship, and you have ones that are more focused on the impersonal, on the metaphysics, the path of knowledge, like Vedanta, and then you have things like Buddhism that are more just focused on kind of the method and proper living as a means to realization. But I mean, what's interesting is, you've come up with this in the 20th, 21st century, and it takes extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary knowledge of the Western tradition and science. But it's quite extraordinary that we can look back at something like Vedanta that's like 2,000-3,000 years old, and they've got quite close to an approximation of reality, in your view. So, would that suggest that? Do you think that mystical experiences, kind of direct perception of the divine, of ultimate reality, that can also transfer this kind of knowledge to people?
Of course, yes. Of course, it takes a certain amount of setup, but mystical experiences are always messages of one kind or another. Whether you can receive them and decipher them, that's another matter entirely. But there is, an information mapping, a channel, and there is the sending and receipt of a message. The message is usually having to do with the nature of either your inner personal reality and your relation to that, or in other words, you're not awake to some part of yourself, or it is about the nature of external reality and how you've got to integrate yourself and your own existence into external reality, into overall reality. Okay, so those are the basic messages. Sometimes, and there is a psychic or precognitive component to this, where you're actually getting, in the message is incorporated some kind of external information to which you would not ordinarily have been assumed to have access. Okay, and then things start getting very, interesting from a psychological point of view. But I think that is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and I mean, another thing that perhaps there's different views within religious traditions on is the afterlife and the soul. I think Buddhists say anatman, like they disagree with the Hindu conception of an eternal soul. Even within Vedanta, there's disagreement. Is this soul, does it have a certain level of independence from Brahman, such that there's an afterlife where we kind of coexist, or does it get kind of swallowed up into the ocean of consciousness, a drop going back into the ocean? So I'm curious. I mean, it seems like from your system, you could, just from my understanding of it, that you could say that the self is kind of an immanent construction, that it's a kind of a society of tellers, or society of less complex consciousness, and that when the body decays, that perhaps you lose that identity of consciousness. So would that be your position, or would you say that there is something that actually pre-exists the physical construction, that there is a soul that survives death of the body?
Well, once again, to go back to Leibnizian monadology, yes, there are these things that he called monads, and they are soul-like. Basically, the soul can be described and defined rather exactly in the CTMU, and it involves a coupling of mind and matter, or instantiation of the form of the entity. And this coupling can be regenerated with changes in consciousness to accompany that. So, in other words, if you die in this world, you can always be recoupled with other instances of yourself in other worlds. Calling reality a grand self simulation implies that there are other alternative simulations that are possible besides the one that we're in right now. There are many possible worlds in the metaverse, okay? And we're in just one of them. And if we're extricated from this one, then we can couple with another, right? We can be provided with a new body or a resurrection body or whatever you want to call it in some other reality in which we can actually possess something approaching the kind of consciousness that we have on this level of reality in this world. You see? So in other words, death is not permanent at all. These monads, they're more or less these, the human soul is a mapping from a primary teller or grand monad, right? Who's up at the top of things. And none of that can ever go out of existence. It can be changed in form, and sometimes is changed in form, but everything is recycled, nothing is lost. So death is really an illusion when we look at it that way. Okay. And if the primary tellor, as it's called in the CTMU, if it in its drive to self-actualize and self-identify, if you are useful to it for that purpose, then it will carry you and regenerate you, just in order to have you around, but precisely because you are consistent with its nature. Okay. That's why it's important that people not be, atheists or blasphemers or disrespectful of the overall coherence of reality, as many people are these days. All right. There's something that has to make it all hang together, and that's God.
So, I mean, we can know that death isn't final, but how limited do you think we are in terms of the nature of an afterlife? I mean, I've found it quite interesting looking at reports of near-death experience. I always kind of wrote those off, was very skeptical of them, but it seems like there's actually something that needs to be explained there in terms of the quite extraordinary experiences people have with no brain activity, and the level of recall they have, and even observation of things that are supposedly happening in the operating room or the hospital. So do you investigate those kinds of things, so psi phenomena? Do you think
Well,
that that's
I've
an
experienced those
interesting
kinds
route?
of things. I've had near-death experiences of my own. I began having them at a very early age, associated with out-of-body experiences, right? And I mean, there were times, I led a kind of a rough and tumble life. There were several times when I came pretty close to death, so I've had that kind of experience. I know exactly what they are. So I don't need to go to hospitals and hear the stories that people recount about them. There are enough others doing that anyway. This is all valuable data
Mhm.
that we can examine, but it's unnecessary to do that from where I sit. Okay, reality is ultimately metaphysical. We are metaphysical, therefore we're not limited to things that can be verified on the empirical level of reality using empirical methodology. Okay, the standard methodology of science. We have to use a new kind of reasoning, logical induction, in this thing called the metaformal system, this ultimate language. It gives us an actual logical framework in which we can infer things about reality, and this is inferred. Okay, this is not something that I need to have empirical data to verify. I can infer that basically the afterlife exists, or can exist, or is supported by the metaverse. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. As far as your own experience, I mean, did you experience some of the common, people talk about like a life review, that the way that people often describe it is like they experience their life in 4D, like they experience every moment at once, but it's like it's kind of atemporal. It's not, it's if they could cram like decades into seconds. They find it quite hard to describe this, but it sounds like a kind of a universal experience among people that have this.
Well, they leap right to the stage of judgment. Basically,
Hmm.
those people, that life review is basically they're going over their lives in order to judge it. People think, well, there's a judgment day where God judges everybody. God is, in reality, the level of identity that we all share. So that's really self-judgment. They're just leaping to that stage of their existence where now they have got to evaluate and pass a judgment on themselves, what they have done. They're seeing their entire lives as one whole and spanning it and enveloping it. And this is, a part of what we're talking about. It's not, of course, the whole thing, right? The idea is that you can be partially retracted to the metaverse and then reinstantiate it if you are consistent with the structure of the metaverse, which is God, which means that atheists are kind of shooting themselves in both feet by denying the existence of it, because it's the only way that they can survive. You see, all these elites and other people that we they want to live forever. They're trying to get that by mechanical means. They want a tech singularity where their consciousness can be uploaded to a computer. That's all nonsense.
Hmm.
That's the way reality is. Basically, we're going to be uploaded. The metaverse will upload you, and then if you are consistent with its structure, then you can be downloaded elsewhere. Okay. But these elites that want to do it all mechanically, that's because they've cut themselves off from the primary teller, from God, from the identity of reality. And they're in trouble. And it's really kind of ironic, because if they were really interested in eternal life, they would be doing the right thing, not trying to convert us all into robotic golems for their eternal pleasure. You see what I mean?
Yeah, this is something I've been talking about myself a lot. That seems like the political ideology we have in the West, if you want to call it liberalism or whatever, but it seems like it's more transforming into a kind of transhumanist pseudo religion. And I noticed this with like a lot of the early advocates for transgenderism, like Martine Rothblatt. She actually wrote a book called "The Transgender to Transhuman Manifesto," and then you look at it, and a lot of the billionaires that have backed the transgender causes, like herself, are also heavily invested in life extension technologies, transhumanism. A lot of them are very interested in the idea of the singularity, and like you said, uploading their mind to a computer. And you start to get the sense that like something deeper is going on here. Like this isn't just about rights for trans people or whatever. That they're actually fundamentally transforming the way that we view the world, and that it used to be a transgender person used to be a transvestite, and then I got to the point, well, we'll kind of use their pronouns to appease them, and then it got to the point, well, actually, there's no gender at all, and you're actually this like free floating consciousness that kind of gets thrown into a body, and now they seem to be kind of imposing this ontology on us where your body has no effect on your personality whatsoever, and the ultimate good of their political endeavor is basically to liberate people from the physical world. And how are they going to do this? Well, they're going to do it through
By trapping them
technology.
in the
So,
physical way.
right.
Right. Yeah.
So it's this kind of paradox. They're trying to find liberation from the body, from the world. It's this almost like neo-Gnostic view of things, and they're doing it through technology and through technological
Well, they
progress
think
and
they're
through
doing
more
it through
materialism.
technology, but they don't have a theory of what they're doing. There is no theoretical support or scientific support for what they're trying to do. Okay, they have not come close to showing that most of this transhumanism techie nonsense that they're coming up with is possible. Okay, the closest thing that what they really need is a framework that actually puts the entire self simulation scenario in perspective, and that's the CTMU. But they hate it. And the reason they hate the CTMU and are canceling the CTMU is that I had the temerity to mention the G word, the God word, on national TV back when I first picked up a little bit of notoriety. Okay, and I said, yes, it's mathematically provable that God exists. And immediately the new atheists all jumped out of the woodwork, and of course a lot of these techie billionaires and so forth, they too are new atheists, so they jumped on the bandwagon, and pretty soon nobody wanted to talk about me or my theory. They all wanted to uphold this illusion that I was some guy who simply had no ability to get along with other people and had more or less just retired to bar bouncing and being a rancher. See, but that's illusory. Okay, in reality, this theory has existed and was introduced to the public at the same time as I was, but it has more or less been squelched during that period. And the reason is these people are just in denial of reality, right? These elites, the oligarchy, these are people that want transhumanism, that want to upload their consciousness to computers. They are literally in denial of the very framework that deals with that kind of metaphysical phenomenon. All right, and it's just it's ironic as hell.
There seems to be a moral aspect to it as well. I mean, if you're living in a way that's clearly against the natural order, if you're some of these people, they're not the prettiest bunch. If if you're ugly, if you're against reality, if you're you're going to reject it on a kind of a fundamental level. They're kind of in revolt against reality itself.
Yes, they are. I mean, it's very obvious. I mean, you look at these gay day parades, and the way these people cavort and carry on, and you were talking about transvestism before. That's more or less an analogy for it's a kind of a symbol for everything that they're talking about, which is basically liberation from reality, from not only the bonds of morality, but the bonds of logic itself. They're going to liberate themselves from that. And you take a look at them, and it's you can't have any respect for people like that. I mean, you can maybe be compassionate toward them, and you can maybe feel that I mean, we got to tell them the truth, but let's not hurt their feelings too much. Let's be gentle about it. But when they respond with this insanity, of going into public schools and insisting that books on deviant sexual behavior be included in children's libraries, when it comes to that kind of thing, you realize, you're dealing with something intransigent, something that just doesn't want to give an inch, that hates reality and hates logic, right? So why would these techie billionaires want to live forever in a reality that they fundamentally hate? And that's
yeah, and of course, it shows that a lot of the negative social consequences we see. I mean, it shows that having a fundamentally wrong theory of reality can lead to bad consequences. I mean, you mentioned like the singularity, and I agree with you. This stuff just seems like sci-fi. But you get to it, and the problem is these people like Kurzweil and these people that write about singularity. It seems like the problem is that they have this totally mechanical view of things, where the only way that they can understand consciousness is just analogized to a computer. And when we can build a complex computer, we can build a consciousness and a soul. It's the same kind of mechanical logic.
But a computer is just a machine. Okay, if you snip a few wires, it all falls apart into parts. There's no coherence to it, right? The parts, the components of a computer are not really communicating with each other. They're communicating with each other localistically, right? At certain junctures in space and time. Everything is terminally confined. It's all confined to the physical realm, but there's no coherence there. In the physical realm, precisely how you define the physical realm is you can break it up into quantum events. Okay? Those quantum events are individually coherent, but they have no higher order coherence, right? Once you remove that by saying that, okay, well, everything has to evolve according to a process called computation, which is essentially mechanical and follows, and more or less mirrors the structure of a Turing machine, then you've got nothing. Right? You have no understanding of reality at all, and there's no way to build reality from a computational scenario. So yeah, these guys like Kurzweil and Wolfram and other people like that think that it's all got to be in some sense computational, they're out to lunch, right? And that's what transhumanism is fueled by, those people, and they don't have a theory. They don't have a theory of reality in which their premise works.
If you'd like to hear the rest of the interview, please click the link in the description.